Imagine the Chicago Stadium in the early 80s. The air inside that old arena was thick with the smell of stale popcorn and the heavy, suffocating silence of a franchise that had lost its way. Before a certain man in red and black began to fly through the air and change the world of sports forever, the Chicago Bulls were a team searching for a pulse, a reason for the fans to actually show up. In the 1981 through 1982 season, the team managed a dismal 27 wins, leaving the stands mostly empty and the front office absolutely desperate for a miracle. They thought they had finally found that miracle in a young man named Quintin Dailey. According to the official archives of the Collegiate Athletic Association, this scoring machine from the University of San Francisco was putting up an incredible 25.2 points per game. He was the golden boy, the explosive guard who was supposed to save professional basketball in the Windy City. He had the speed, the jump shot, and a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But as the scouts watched his highlight reels with wide eyes, a dark cloud was already gathering over the West Coast. Information that would later surface in the records of the San Francisco Police Department showed that a statement had been filed that would change everything before the first whistle of his professional career even blew. Why did the league ignore the warning signs that were flashing in bright red? Was the raw talent of Quintin Dailey so blinding that the management chose to look the other way, hoping the trouble would just evaporate? The secrets hidden in those early reports suggested a pattern of behavior that was far from heroic. The Windy City was waiting for a savior, but they were about to receive a scandal that would tear the city apart. The scouts saw a superstar, but the legal files in California were already telling a much darker story. It was a quiet night in December of 1981 when the soaring trajectory of a future superstar hit a concrete wall. While the rest of the country was preparing for the holiday season, a student nurse at the University of San Francisco was walking into a police station with a story that would send shockwaves through the entire sports world. The formal documents, which were officially filed in February of 1982, described an encounter in a campus dormitory that no one in the basketball community wanted to believe. This was not just a simple misunderstanding or a minor slip-up by a young athlete. It was a legal nightmare that threatened to end the career of Quintin Dailey before he ever signed a single professional contract. According to the California court archives, the situation was viewed with such gravity that a judge eventually set the bail at a staggering $100,000. Reporters at the time noted the extreme tension in the air as the young star tried to maintain a mask of innocence while his high-priced lawyers worked feverishly behind closed doors to contain the damage. But here is the part that still haunts the history of the game and raises questions decades later. If the player was truly innocent, why did the legal team move with such desperate speed to keep the specific details out of a public trial? The paper trail from that era suggests a frantic scramble by powerful interests to protect a multi-million-dollar investment. Investigative reports from major sports media outlets later pointed to inconsistencies that were never fully addressed in the light of day. As the court date approached, the defense came forward with a proposal that left the public wondering what really happened behind those closed doors. The fans wanted to believe in their hero, but the evidence sitting in the prosecutor's office was a ticking time bomb. The investigation was about to take a turn that would leave the basketball world breathless and forever change the way we look at collegiate stars. By the time June of 1982 rolled around, the future of Quintin Dailey was being decided not on the polished hardwood of a basketball court, but in a wood-paneled room in a California courthouse. The eyes of every sports executive in the country were fixed on that room, waiting to see if the star would face a long period of confinement, or if he would be allowed to walk free and join the professional ranks. According to the official court transcript from that month, Quintin Dailey entered a specific plea for a charge involving indecent liberties. It was a calculated move that allowed him to avoid the most severe consequences of the original, much heavier allegations. the judge handed down a sentence of 3 years of probation, a decision that many observers in the gallery felt was little more than a slap on the wrist for a man of his stature and potential. Investigative articles from that summer highlight a growing sense of unease among the public as the legal system seemed to bend and flex for a gifted athlete who was destined for fame. But why would a man with everything to lose admit to any level of wrongdoing if there was absolutely nothing to hide? This plea deal became a permanent stain on his resume, a document that would follow him to every city, every arena, and every locker room for the rest of his life. With the ink barely dry on his probation papers, Quintin Dailey packed his bags for the biggest stage in the world. He was heading to the draft, but the cheering fans he expected were being replaced by a wave of public outrage that he never saw coming. As the draft clock began to tick, the Chicago Bulls were holding a ticket that would either save their franchise or burn it to the ground. The choice they made in the front office that day would spark a firestorm that the city of Chicago would not forget for generations. The 19th of June in 1982 is a date that remains etched in the memory of every longtime sports fan in the city of Chicago. As the executives gathered for the annual selection of new talent, a heavy tension hung over the proceedings. The Chicago Bulls held the 7th overall pick in the first round, a position that could define the future of the franchise for a decade. But instead of a celebration, the announcement of the name Quintin Dailey felt more like a thunderclap on a clear day. While other teams were looking for character and leadership, the Bulls management made a fateful choice that prioritized raw scoring ability over public sentiment. They decided to gamble on a young man who was still under a legal cloud, a move that many in the industry viewed as a desperate grab for relevance at the cost of the team's integrity. According to reports from the major sports media outlets of that summer, the decision was not unanimous within the front office, but the desire to sell tickets to a losing arena eventually won the argument. Jerry Reinsdorf, the man at the helm, later spoke in interviews about the necessity of taking risks to build a winner, but the public was not buying the explanation. At that moment, the team was valued at a fraction of what it is today, and every decision was scrutinized by a fan base that was tired of losing. The investigative trail from that draft day suggests that several other clubs had completely removed Quintin Dailey from their boards due to the reports coming out of San Francisco. Yet the Bulls moved forward, signing the rookie to a contract that reflected his status as a top-tier talent. But as the ink dried on that multi-million-dollar agreement, a different kind of storm was brewing on the streets of Chicago. The front office thought they were buying a savior, but they were actually inviting a level of scrutiny that would soon turn the stadium into a battlefield. The question on everyone's lips was simple: how much is a point worth if it comes with such a heavy price tag? The reaction to the arrival of Quintin Dailey was unlike anything the professional basketball world had ever seen. Usually, a top 10 pick is greeted with a parade and a sense of hope, but for this young man, the welcome was a wall of pure, unadulterated hostility. In the autumn of 1982, as the preseason began, the area surrounding the Chicago Stadium became a focal point for intense public protest. According to eyewitness accounts and news reports from the time, more than 50 determined individuals, primarily women's rights advocates and concerned citizens, stood outside the arena gates with placards and bullhorns. They weren't there to cheer for a championship. They were there to demand that a man with his legal history be removed from the team. In the archives of the local press from that era, you can find mentions of a petition that gathered thousands of signatures in a matter of weeks, all calling for the immediate cancellation of his contract. The atmosphere inside the building was even more surreal. When Quintin Dailey was first introduced to the home crowd, the legendary announcer's voice was drowned out by a chorus of boos that shook the very foundation of the old stadium. Imagine being a 21-year-old athlete, stepping onto the floor for the biggest moment of your life, only to realize that the people paying for the seats want you to fail. Investigative reports from those early games highlight the extreme isolation the player felt. Even some of his own teammates seemed hesitant to stand too close to him during the national anthem. The management had hoped the noise would die down once the game started, but the controversy was only feeding a fire that was about to consume the locker room. This was no longer just about basketball. It was a public trial being held every 48 minutes on the hardwood. How could any player, no matter how gifted, perform under the weight of an entire city's judgment? Despite the crushing pressure and the constant reminders of his past, Quintin Dailey proved almost immediately that his talent was undeniable. During the 1982 through 1983 season, he performed with a level of intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun his own reputation. On the court, he was a blur of motion, a scoring machine that could find the basket from almost anywhere. According to the official statistical archives of the professional league, he finished his debut season with an impressive average of 17.5 points per game. This performance was strong enough to earn him a spot on the prestigious all-rookie first team, a feat that usually signals the birth of a legend. But while his numbers were soaring, his personal life was beginning to show signs of a deep psychological fracture. Behind the scenes, the young star was becoming a ghost. He avoided the media, skipped team functions, and often retreated to his hotel room the moment the final whistle blew. Those who were close to the team at the time noted in their memoirs that the roar of the crowd, which was still mixed with jeers, seemed to take a heavy toll on his spirit. He was playing for a team that needed him, but he was doing it in a state of total emotional exile. Investigative reports from sports journalists who covered the Bulls that year described a man who was increasingly disconnected from reality, seeking comfort in ways that would eventually lead to his downfall. He had the money, he had the fame, and he had the statistics, but he didn't have the one thing every player craves: the respect of his peers and the love of the city. As the season drew to a close, the question wasn't whether he could play the game, but how long he could survive the internal pressure cooker he had created. The foundation was already starting to crack, and the first signs of a dangerous dependency were beginning to surface in the quiet hours after the lights went out. As the sun went down over the Chicago skyline in the mid-'80s, a different kind of game was beginning for Quintin Dailey. The bright lights of the stadium were often replaced by the neon glow of the city's most exclusive and dangerous night spots. For a young man with millions in the bank and a desperate need to escape the booze of the crowd, the temptation of the nightlife proved to be a siren song he couldn't resist. It wasn't long before the rumors began to circulate in the dark corners of the locker room. Teammates started to notice that the explosive guard was arriving at morning practices with glazed eyes and a lack of focus that was impossible to ignore. According to the memoirs of several veterans who played alongside him during that era, the erratic behavior of Quintin Dailey was becoming a poorly kept secret that the league was desperate to contain. In December of 1983, the situation reached a breaking point. Documents from that period suggest that the league office initiated its first internal inquiry into the player's personal habits after several reports of missed meetings and unexplained absences. While the public saw a scoring machine, the investigative trail reveals a man who was increasingly reliant on illicit substances to numb the pain of his public image. The management tried to handle the matter quietly, hoping that a few stern warnings would bring their star back to reality. But as the investigative reports from major sports media outlets later hinted, the influence of the City of Shadows had already taken a firm hold on his lifestyle. How much did the coaching staff truly know about what was happening behind closed doors? The evidence suggests they were willing to overlook the red flags as long as he kept putting the ball in the hoop. But the clock was ticking, and Quintin Dailey was about to be called into a private office for a meeting that would change the course of his career forever. The landscape of professional basketball changed forever in the summer of 1984. But for Quintin Dailey, it was the beginning of a slow and painful eclipse. When the Chicago Bulls used their third overall pick to draft a young phenomenon from North Carolina, the hierarchy of the team was shattered in an instant. Suddenly, the man who was supposed to be the savior found himself standing in the massive shadow of a rookie who would eventually become a global icon. The tension was palpable from the very first day of training camp. While the new arrival was signing a groundbreaking contract worth more than $6 million, Quintin Dailey was looking at his own diminishing status with a mixture of resentment and disbelief. The investigative data from that pivotal season shows a dramatic shift in the team's dynamic. According to official league records, the average playing time for Quintin Dailey dropped by approximately 10 minutes per game almost immediately after the 1984 draft. It wasn't just about the minutes, it was about the power. The flashy guard who once commanded the ball now had to wait for scraps while the new king took flight. Sports journalists of the era reported on a growing chill between the two players, noting that they rarely spoke and never shared the same space off the court. The financial disparity was a constant source of friction, as the rookie's massive endorsement deals made the veteran's salary look like pocket change. Quintin Dailey felt he had earned his place through the fire of public hatred, only to have the throne handed to a newcomer. The spark of jealousy was undeniable, and it wouldn't be long before that spark turned into a full-blown firestorm inside the walls of the Chicago Stadium. By November of 1984, the Cold War between the established star and the rising legend had turned into an open conflict that threatened to derail the entire season. The practice facility became a theater of war where Quintin Dailey tried to prove, day after day, that he was still the alpha in the room. He would challenge the rookie to intense one-on-one battles, often playing with a level of aggression that bordered on the unprofessional. But the more he pushed, the more he realized that the tide of history was against him. According to a detailed report published in the Chicago Tribune at the time, there was a specific incident during a team meeting where the tension finally boiled over into a shouting match that left the coaching staff stunned. The disciplinary records of the club reveal that Quintin Dailey was hit with a significant fine of $5,000 following a game where he reportedly refused to enter the contest as a substitute. It was a clear act of defiance, a public statement that he would not play second fiddle to anyone, not even a future Hall of Famer. This refusal to yield was seen by many as the final nail in the coffin of his relationship with the management. While the rest of the world was falling in love with the high-flying rookie, Quintin Dailey was becoming an island. He began to ignore passes on the court and intentionally played a style of basketball that disrupted the new offensive system. Investigative reports from that winter describe a locker room divided into camps, with the veterans caught between a past they understood and a future they couldn't stop. But while he fought his battles on the hardwood, the demons he had invited into his life were waiting for him in the parking lot. He was seeking comfort in places that the cameras couldn't see, and the price of that comfort was about to become higher than any fine the league could ever impose. As the 1980s progressed, the professional discipline of Quintin Dailey began to dissolve in a way that left the coaching staff in a state of absolute disbelief. While his peers were spending their off hours in the weight room or studying game film, the man once hailed as the next big thing was developing a reputation for a different kind of appetite. It was during this period that the whispers about his physical condition turned into a loud public conversation that the Chicago Bulls management could no longer ignore. The athlete who once possessed the agility of a jungle cat was suddenly struggling to keep up with the pace of the game, and the reason was hidden in the greasy boxes of fast food joints scattered around the city. According to the vivid recollections of the head coach at the time, Kevin Lockery, there was a specific and legendary incident that sounds more like a comedy sketch than a professional sports report. Eyewitness accounts from the locker room suggest that Quintin Dailey actually had the audacity to order a large pizza and have it delivered to the stadium just minutes before the opening tip-off. In the official scouting reports from that season, the numbers were staggering. His weight had reportedly ballooned to over 110 kilograms, which was nearly 15 kilograms over his ideal playing weight. Investigative journals from the mid-'80s described a player who seemed more interested in the concession stand than the scoreboard. But why would a man with a multi-million-dollar career on the line treat his body with such blatant disregard? Some analysts argued it was a form of silent protest against the team, while others saw it as a symptom of a much deeper, more destructive pattern. This wasn't just about a love for junk food. It was a visible sign that the star was losing his grip on reality. The laughter from the opposing benches was growing louder, and the Bulls were realized that their investment was literally weighing them down. But as the jokes about his diet filled the newspapers, a much darker secret was about to be revealed in a medical report that would stop the laughter once and for all. The jokes about pizza and poor conditioning came to a screeching halt in February of 1985 when the Chicago Bulls issued a press release that sent a chill through the entire league. It was no longer a matter of missed practices or extra slices. The team officially announced that Quintin Dailey was being placed on the suspended list to seek professional help for his personal dependencies. The mask had finally slipped, and the public was forced to confront the reality that their star guard was fighting a battle that no amount of talent could win on its own. According to the internal records of the league's disciplinary committee, this wasn't an optional vacation. It was a mandatory intervention designed to save a life that was spiraling out of control. The details of his stay in the specialized facility were kept under a tight seal, but the financial consequences were made very public. Investigative reports from that month indicate that the league imposed a significant fine of approximately $25,000 on top of the loss of his regular salary during the 30-day treatment period. This was a massive sum in the economy of 1985, intended to serve as a wake-up call for a player who thought he was above the rules. But the question remained: was 30 days enough to erase years of destructive habits and the crushing psychological weight of being the city's most hated hero? While he was away in the clinic, the team continued to move forward without him, and the fans began to realize that the era of Quintin Dailey might be ending before it truly began. The investigative trail shows that during his absence, the management began making phone calls to other cities, looking for anyone willing to take a chance on a broken star. He returned to the court in March, but the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow stare. The city of Chicago was ready to move on, and the final papers for his exile were already being drafted in the high-rent offices of the Bulls executives. By the autumn of 1986, the relationship between the city of Chicago and Quintin Dailey had reached a state of total toxicity. The fans were tired of the excuses, the coaches were tired of the drama, and the front office was tired of the legal and medical bills. In September of 1986, the inevitable finally happened. The Chicago Bulls officially severed their ties with the man who was supposed to be their savior. It was a cold and unceremonious departure for a former 7th overall pick. Despite his incredible scoring average of over 16 points per game, the team found that no other club was willing to offer a significant trade package for a player with such a heavy baggage of scandals and health concerns. According to the transaction logs of the league, Quintin Dailey eventually landed with the Los Angeles Clippers, a team that was widely considered the graveyard of the NBA at the time. He moved to the West Coast not as a celebrated hero, but as a low-cost gamble for a franchise that had nothing to lose. Investigative articles from the Los Angeles media in the late 80s noted that his arrival was met with a shrug of indifference rather than a wave of excitement. The contract he signed was a far cry from the lucrative deals he had once commanded in the Windy City. He was now in a city famous for its temptations, a place where the nightlife was even more dangerous than the one he had left behind in Chicago. Would the change of scenery provide the reset he so desperately needed, or would the glitz of Hollywood provide the final ingredients for his ultimate downfall? The investigative evidence suggests that while he was trying to rebuild his career on the court, his financial life was beginning to crumble into a chaotic mess of debts and poor decisions. The stage was set for a final act in a city where stars are made, but where fallen icons are often forgotten in the shadows of the palms. Welcome to the City of Angels, where the palm trees sway, and the bright lights of Hollywood can blind even the most seasoned professional. For Quintin Dailey, the move to the Los Angeles Clippers was less of a fresh start and more of a descent into a sporting purgatory. At the time, the Clippers were widely regarded as the absolute basement of the league, a place where careers went to wither away under a culture of losing and neglect. The investigative records from the 1987 through 1988 season tell a story of absolute futility that would break the spirit of almost any competitor. The team managed a pathetic 17 wins the entire year, a statistic that made them a laughingstock in the national media. Yet, in the middle of this wreckage, Quintin Dailey was still finding a way to put the ball in the basket, proving that his raw talent was a flame that even the darkest environment couldn't fully extinguish. According to the official archives of the professional league, he maintained a personal scoring average of 16 points per game during his tenure in Los Angeles. But while the numbers on the scoreboard looked respectable, the man behind the jersey was becoming a ghost. Reporters who covered the team at the time noted that he moved through the locker room with a 1,000-yard stare, rarely engaging with the press or his fellow players. He was surrounded by a roster of castaways, other talented athletes who had been discarded by better organizations for their own personal failings. The investigative trail suggests that the chaotic environment in Los Angeles provided the perfect cover for his deteriorating lifestyle. In a city where everyone is chasing a dream, Quintin Dailey seemed to be running away from a nightmare that followed him from Chicago. The question that haunted the local sports media was simple. Was he actually trying to win, or was he just collecting a paycheck while he waited for the sun to go down? The secrets of his time in Hollywood were not found on the stat sheet, but in the late-night logs of the city's most notorious establishments. The stage was set for a financial collapse that would leave his bank accounts as empty as the arena's trophy case. Where does the money go when a superstar falls from grace? This is the question that investigators and forensic analysts have asked about the career of Quintin Dailey for decades. Throughout his journey in the professional ranks, he earned a fortune that most people can only dream of. According to the detailed financial summaries of his various contracts, the total earnings for Quintin Dailey over his 10-year career amounted to approximately $6 million. In the economy of the 1980s and early 1990s, that was a king's ransom, enough to secure the comfort of several generations. But as he walked the streets of Los Angeles, the reality of his bank balance was far more grim than the flashy headlines suggested. The investigative documents from the Internal Revenue Service, commonly known as the IRS, paint a picture of a man drowning in a sea of red ink. By the late 80s, official filings indicated a staggering debt of over $200,000 in unpaid taxes and penalties. Where did the millions vanish? The paper trail suggests a chaotic mix of predatory associates, failed business ventures, and a level of personal spending that defied all logic. Sources close to the player frequently spoke of his legendary generosity toward individuals who clearly did not have his best interests at heart. He was seen as an easy target, a man who would hand over thousands of dollars to anyone with a convincing story. But the most alarming entries in his financial ledger were the ones that couldn't be explained by a new car or a fancy dinner. There was a dark hole in his budget, a vacuum that seemed to suck up every dollar he made on the hardwood. Was he being pressured because of his past indiscretions, or was he simply burning through his wealth to maintain his forbidden habits? The financial wreckage was a clear warning sign that the end of the road was approaching, and the creditors were beginning to knock on the locker room door with a persistence that no security guard could stop. In the high-stakes world of professional basketball, showing up is half the battle. But for Quintin Dailey, the arena was becoming a place he desperately wanted to avoid. During his final years with the Los Angeles Clippers, a bizarre phenomenon began to occur. The star guard would simply vanish. He wouldn't call the front office, he wouldn't answer his phone, and his teammates were left wondering if he was even still in the city. The investigative records from the 1988 through 1989 season highlight a total of 12 games where Quintin Dailey was listed as absent without a valid medical or personal excuse. These weren't just minor incidents. They were a total breakdown of professional conduct that left the head coach, Don Chaney, in a state of constant fury. The internal disciplinary files of the organization reveal that the player was hit with a mountain of fines that eventually totaled $50,000 in a single season. These were not minor penalties. They were a desperate attempt to force a man to respect the game that had given him everything. But Quintin Dailey seemed indifferent to the financial loss. When he did decide to show up, he would often complain of phantom injuries, physical pains that the team's medical staff could never quite verify through examinations or technology. Was he truly hurting, or was his body finally revolting against the years of neglect and the consumption of illicit substances? Investigative reports from sports insiders at the time suggested that his injuries were often a convenient cover for the physical toll that his nightlife was taking on his stamina. He was ghosting his own career, playing a game of hide-and-seek with the management that could only have one logical ending. The league office was beginning to look at his file with a cold, analytical eye, and the word unreliable was being whispered in every front office in the country. The countdown to his final exit had officially begun, and the next stop on his journey would be a cold, rainy city that offered one last chance at redemption. In the cold, rain-soaked streets of the Pacific Northwest, a final door opened for a man who had burned almost every bridge in the professional league. By October of 1990, the reputation of Quintin Dailey was so heavily tarnished that most executives wouldn't even answer a phone call from his representatives. However, the Seattle Supersonics decided to take one last, desperate gamble on the former scoring champion. They offered him a one-year contract, hoping that the change from the glitz of Los Angeles to the gray skies of Seattle would finally force him to focus on the game. It was a low-risk move for the team, but for the player, it was a final lifeline in a career that was rapidly sinking into the depths of obscurity. The investigative data from that period, according to the official archives of the Seattle franchise, shows a man who was a mere shadow of the athlete who had once challenged the dominance of the greatest players in the world. During the 1990 through 1991 season, the statistical collapse was impossible to ignore. His scoring average plummeted to a career low of just 6 points per game, a staggering drop from the high-flying days in the Windy City. The investigative reports from local sports journalists noted that his explosive first step was gone, replaced by a heavy, labored stride that suggested a body nearing its breaking point. He was only 30 years old, an age when most stars are in their prime, but the years of neglecting his physical health and indulging in forbidden dependencies had clearly taken their toll. The scouts' notes from that final season described a player who looked exhausted before the first quarter was even over. The gamble in Seattle wasn't paying off, and the management was beginning to realize that the fire that once fueled Quintin Dailey had finally been extinguished by the very lifestyle he chose to lead. The end wasn't just coming, it was already standing at the door. The lights finally dimmed on the professional career of Quintin Dailey in a way that no one could have predicted back in 1982. There were no retirement tours, no standing ovations from the home crowd, and certainly no jerseys being retired to the rafters. In April of 1992, the man who was once expected to be the face of a dynasty played his final minutes on a professional court, and the world barely noticed. He walked off the floor and into a locker room that felt more like a waiting room for the forgotten. According to the final career tallies recorded by the league's Statistical Bureau, Quintin Dailey finished his 10-year journey with a total of 7,473 points. It was a respectable number for a journeyman, but for a 7th overall pick with his level of natural talent, it was a haunting reminder of what might have been. Investigative reports from the spring of 1992 indicate that not a single team in the league expressed interest in signing him for the following season. He had become an athletic pariah, a cautionary tale that coaches used to frighten younger players into staying on the straight and narrow path. When he cleared out his locker, he wasn't just leaving a stadium. He was leaving the only world that had ever truly valued him for his gifts. The documents from his final professional exit show a man who was technically a free agent, but in reality, he was a man with nowhere left to go. The investigative trail of his career ends with a series of quiet transactions and a final paycheck that was a fraction of his former glory. Why did a man with such a high ceiling hit the floor so hard and so fast? The answer lay in the files of the league's security offices, which were filled with reports of missed meetings and failed expectations. Quintin Dailey vanished from the headlines almost overnight, retreating into a world of shadows where the cheering of the crowds was replaced by the silence of a life without a purpose. When the bright lights of the stadium finally go dark, the city of Las Vegas often becomes a final refuge for those who have lost their way in the pursuit of fame. In the mid-90s, Quintin Dailey resurfaced in the desert, far away from the polished hardwood of the professional arenas. He attempted to keep his connection to the game alive by playing in the minor leagues and even taking his talents overseas. But the magic was gone. However, it was in Las Vegas that he began a surprising and little-known chapter of his life, working as a community organizer and a mentor for young people in the local parks and recreation department. According to the employment records of the city of Las Vegas from that era, he spent years trying to give back to a community that didn't know his name or his scandalous past. During this period of relative obscurity, he gave a series of rare and deeply personal interviews to the local television station, KLAS-TV. In these recorded segments, which are still stored in the station's archives, a much older and more reflective Quintin Dailey spoke about the mistakes he had made and the heavy price he had paid for his choices. He didn't sound like a bitter athlete. He sounded like a man who had finally made peace with his own demons. Investigative reports from local Nevada media outlets in the early 2000s described him as a fixture in the local basketball scene, often seen teaching kids the same jump shot that had once made him a millionaire. But even as he tried to rebuild his soul, the damage he had done to his physical frame was a ticking time bomb. The years of consuming high-calorie fast food and the long-term effects of unauthorized substances were quietly destroying his cardiovascular system from the inside out. He was living a quiet life, but the final bill for his chaotic youth was about to come due. As he walked the streets of Vegas, he was a man living on borrowed time, unaware that his final departure was already being scripted by the very habits he thought he had left behind. The night of November 8, 2010, was just like any other in the neon-soaked landscape of Las Vegas, a city where fortunes are made and lost in the blink of an eye. But while the slot machines chimed and the tourists wandered the strip, a heavy silence was descending upon a modest home in Nevada. For one former superstar, the long and turbulent journey that began in the gyms of San Francisco was about to reach its final quiet conclusion. Quintin Dailey, the man who once shared the floor with the greatest legends of the professional league, was found in his bed, having passed away in his sleep. According to the official records from the Clark County Medical Examiner's Office, the athlete was only 49 years of age when he reached the end of his path. It was a premature conclusion for a man who had once possessed the physical power and agility to dominate any opponent on the hardwood. The investigative reports from the local authorities noted that the discovery was made after family members became concerned when they couldn't reach him for several hours. When the police arrived at the scene, they found no evidence of a struggle or any unauthorized entry into the residence. The documentation from that evening describes a man who seemed to have simply slipped away from a world that had given him so much fame and so much pain in equal measure. Investigative journalists who had followed his career for decades were stunned by the news, as many believed he had finally found a sense of peace in his later years. But as the news of his passing began to spread through the sports world, the focus quickly shifted from his accomplishments to the mysterious circumstances surrounding the failure of his body at such a young age. The secrets of his physical decline were hidden behind the closed doors of the morgue, and the public was waiting for a biological ledger that would explain how a world-class athlete could lose his life before reaching the age of 50. The investigation was just beginning, and the findings would soon reveal the true price of the fast-lane lifestyle he had led during his prime. When the medical professionals began their thorough examination of the physical remains of Quintin Dailey, they encountered a body that told a story of extreme wear and tear far beyond what its 49 years suggested. The official autopsy report, a document that serves as the final evidence of a life lived under constant pressure, revealed a tragic truth about the biological cost of his choices. According to the medical forensic evidence filed in the state of Nevada, the primary cause of his passing was hypertensive cardiovascular disease. This was not a sudden accident or a single moment of misfortune. It was the cumulative result of years of ignoring his personal health, a diet filled with high-calorie fast food, and the long-term strain of various forbidden dependencies. The investigative files from the Las Vegas Police Department confirmed that there were no signs of toxic substances in his system at the moment of his departure, but the damage to his internal organs was already permanent and profound. The report highlighted that his heart had become dangerously enlarged, a condition often seen in individuals who have lived under chronic stress or who have struggled with weight issues for an extended period. Forensic experts who analyzed the data noted that his physical frame had been under immense pressure since his days in the Windy City, when the pizzeria on the bench became more than just a locker room joke. The documentation suggests that his cardiovascular system was essentially a ticking time bomb that had been winding down since the 1980s. Investigative articles in major medical and sports journals later pointed to this as a cautionary tale for all professional athletes who believe their youth makes them invincible. Why didn't he seek more aggressive treatment in his final years? Some say he was weary of the constant scrutiny of doctors and trainers, while others believe he simply didn't realize how close he was to the edge. The autopsy provided the answers that the public demanded, but it also painted a picture of a man who had been slowly losing his internal battle for decades. The evidence was clear. Quintin Dailey had survived the scandals and the hatred of the fans, but he could not survive the quiet, invisible decay of his own heart. The news of the departure of Quintin Dailey reached the front offices of the Chicago Bulls on November 9, 2010, and for a moment, the busy world of professional basketball paused to remember a ghost from its past. The team that had once tried to distance itself from the scandals of the 1980s was now forced to acknowledge the man who had been its primary scoring threat before the arrival of its greatest icon. The organization issued a formal statement expressing its condolences to the family, an official document that was published on their digital platforms and sent to every major news outlet in the country. It was a surreal moment for many longtime fans who remembered the days when the city was divided over whether he should even be allowed to wear the uniform. But in the wake of his passing, the anger had been replaced by a somber appreciation for his natural gifts. Perhaps the most significant reaction came from the man who had once stood in the center of the spotlight that Quintin Dailey so desperately wanted. Michael Jordan, the legendary number 23, provided a quote for the official press release that resonated across the entire league. He described Quintin Dailey as a remarkably talented player and acknowledged the scoring ability that had made him such a dangerous opponent and a valuable teammate during their early seasons together. Investigative reports from that week noted that several other former teammates and coaches from the 1984 roster also reached out to share their memories of the guard's undeniable skill. However, even in these tributes, there was a lingering sense of what might have been. The records show that while the team was honoring his memory, they were also acknowledging the tragic reality of a talent that was never fully realized due to the shadows of scandal and personal struggle. The statement from the Bulls served as a final piece of formal recognition for a man who had spent most of his life as an outsider. But as the tributes poured in, a new question began to surface among sports historians. Why was his name missing from the most prestigious honors of the game? When we talk about the legends of the game, we usually think of golden trophies, retired jerseys, and emotional speeches at the Hall of Fame. But for Quintin Dailey, the path to immortality was blocked by a wall of his own making. In the eyes of the basketball establishment, he became the ultimate anti-hero, a man whose physical gifts were constantly at war with his public reputation. If you look strictly at the numbers, the case for his greatness is surprisingly strong. According to the official statistical database of Basketball Reference, Quintin Dailey finished his journey with a career scoring average of 14.1 points per game. In the world of professional sports, these are the kind of numbers that usually belong to a perennial star, a player who anchors a franchise for a decade. Yet, despite his explosive performances and his selection to the All-Rookie First Team in 1983, as confirmed by the league's historical archives, his name is nowhere to be found when the greatest of all time are discussed. The investigative records of the league's selection committees suggest that a character clause was unofficially applied to his legacy. While other bad boys of the era were eventually forgiven for their outbursts, the specific nature of the scandals surrounding Quintin Dailey made him a radioactive figure in the eyes of the decision-makers. Sports columnists of the late 90s often pointed out that his absence from individual award ceremonies was not due to a lack of skill, but due to a collective desire to erase his era from the history books. He was a man who played the game at a level of intensity that few could match, but he did it without the moral compass that the league demanded from its icons. The investigative trail of his career highlights a tragic paradox. He was too good to be ignored, but too controversial to be celebrated. This silent exclusion raises a haunting question that still lingers in the minds of veteran fans. Was he punished for his actions, or was he a scapegoat for an era that wanted to appear cleaner than it actually was? As the years passed, the debate over his place in history only intensified, especially when new details about his early legal troubles began to leak from the sealed archives of the West Coast. For decades, the 1982 incident at the University of San Francisco was treated as an open and shut case of a young star making a catastrophic mistake. But as we dig deeper into the investigative reports and the legal registries of the state of California, a much more complex and perhaps more disturbing picture begins to emerge. In the early 2000s, a group of dedicated sports investigators began to re-examine the old court materials, and what they found suggested that the narrative of that February night might have been carefully curated by interests far more powerful than a college student. One of the most shocking fact anchors found in the legal registries is the total absence of any civil lawsuits following the criminal proceedings. In the high-stakes world of university athletics, where a star's reputation is worth millions, the lack of a follow-up civil action is almost unheard of and points toward a series of behind-the-scenes agreements that were never disclosed to the public. According to investigative articles published in major sports media outlets during the 2005 season, some witnesses from that era began to suggest that the evidence against Quintin Dailey was far less substantial than the headlines implied. These reports hinted at a potential setup or a massive misunderstanding that was blown out of proportion by a local media hungry for a scandal involving a high-profile athlete. Why did the player accept a plea deal if the evidence was shaky? The investigative documents from the defense team's original strategy sessions, which surfaced in later journalistic inquiries, suggest that the pressure from the basketball program to make it go away was overwhelming. He was told that a long trial would end his professional dreams, even if he was eventually cleared. So he took the deal to save his career, not realizing that he was actually signing a life sentence of public condemnation. The victim in this story might have been the truth itself, buried under layers of university politics and legal maneuvering. This revelation turns the entire biography of Quintin Dailey on its head, moving him from the role of a villain to a potential victim of a system that treats young athletes like disposable assets. But even if the truth was different, the damage was done, and it prevented the creation of the most terrifying duo in the history of the sport. Close your eyes and imagine a different 1980s. Imagine a world where the Chicago Bulls didn't just have one soaring superstar, but a two-headed monster that dominated both ends of the floor. This wasn't a fantasy. It was the reality for a brief, flickering moment during the 1984 through 85 season. According to the internal box scores stored in the Chicago Bulls archives, there were several games during that historic year where both Quintin Dailey and the rookie phenom Michael Jordan each scored over 20 points. In those moments, the team looked invincible, a glimpse into a future where they could have dominated the league for a generation. Expert analysts from ESPN have often revisited these specific games, noting that the combined scoring power of these two guards was statistically higher than almost any other backcourt pairing in the history of the franchise. The investigative data from the mid-'80s suggests that if Quintin Dailey had maintained his focus and stayed clear of the illicit dependencies that were slowly consuming his stamina, the Bulls might not have had to wait until the 90s to start their championship run, but the locker room reports from that season paint a picture of a missed connection. While the young king was building his empire, the veteran was sinking into the shadows, his potential being eaten away by the very distractions he used to escape his own reputation. The fact anchors of that season, specifically the decline in their shared court time during the final months of 1985, serve as the technical proof of a partnership that was falling apart before it could even begin. Why didn't the coaching staff do more to bridge the gap between these two explosive talents? The investigative trail suggests that the management had already given up on the idea of a tandem, choosing instead to put all their chips on the rookie. It was a calculated move that worked for the franchise, but it left the story of Quintin Dailey as a tragic what-if in the annals of basketball history. He was the piece of the puzzle that almost fit, the star who could have been a legend's greatest ally, but instead became his greatest regret. The story of Quintin Dailey is not just a tale of lost points or missed shots. It is a profound reflection of a turbulent era when the lines between stardom and self-destruction were razor thin. As we look back at his 10-year journey through the professional ranks, we see a man who was both a victim of his own choices and a product of a system that often prioritized highlight reels over human welfare. Today, the names of his contemporaries are immortalized in bronze and neon, but the legacy of this explosive guard remains a whisper in the halls of the old Chicago Stadium. According to the official franchise records of the Chicago Bulls, the Los Angeles Clippers, and the Seattle Supersonics, the jerseys he once wore with such ferocity, numbers 44 and 20, have never been raised to the rafters in his honor. He remains a transient figure in the history of the game, a scorer whose impact was undeniable, but whose reputation made him an eternal outsider in the eyes of the establishment. The final chapter of his life was written in the quiet suburbs of Nevada, far from the roar of the crowds that once alternately cheered and jeered his every move. Investigative reports from the autumn of 2010 confirmed that his memorial service was held in the city of Las Vegas, attended by a small circle of family and former associates who chose to remember the man rather than the scandal. He was laid to rest as a citizen of the desert, a world away from the cold winds of Lake Michigan that had witnessed his rise and his initial stumble. Why does the world of sports continue to look at his career with such a mixture of awe and discomfort? The answer lies in the fact that Quintin Dailey was a mirror for our own contradictions, showing us that even the most spectacular talent can be undone by a single night of roguish judgment and a lifetime of hidden struggles. His 7,473 points are etched in the record books, but his true legacy is the heavy silence that follows his name whenever the greats are discussed. As we close the file on this investigation, we are left with one final haunting thought. Was Quintin Dailey a villain, a victim, or simply a man who could not survive the weight of his own potential? The tragedy of his life is not that he failed to win a championship ring, but that he was never able to win the internal war within himself. His story serves as a permanent warning to every young athlete who steps onto the court today. The game can give you the world, but it cannot protect you from the shadows you carry inside. The lights have finally gone out for the man who was supposed to be the king of Chicago, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a bouncing ball and the memory of a talent that was simply too heavy to carry. He was the seventh pick, the seventh wonder, and finally, the seventh ghost of a dynasty that never was.